Welcome back to Wonders of the Word. I have an amazing story for you today. Stick with me for just a few minutes and you will find it amazing too. You know that when Jesus was crucified, he was hung on the cross between two thieves. Did you know that this story is foreshadowed in the Old Testament? It occurs in Genesis chapter 40. In Genesis chapter 40, we read of Joseph, who was a very clear type of Christ, falsely imprisoned, wrongfully imprisoned. Pharaoh becomes angry with his two servants, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he imprisons them with Joseph. So you have Joseph imprisoned with two criminals, the cupbearer and the baker. While they're in prison, they each have a dream. The cupbearer dreams of a vine with 3 branches. This vine buds, blossoms, and produces grapes. The cupbearer sees himself squeezing the grapes into the cup and putting the cup in Pharaoh's hand again. So he describes his dream to Joseph, and Joseph gives the interpretation. Joseph says that after 3 days, the cupbearer will be restored to his position and he will again put the cup in Pharaoh's hand. Well, the baker also had a dream, and since his friend got a good interpretation, he gives his dream to Joseph, hoping for a favorable interpretation as well. The baker dreams of 3 baskets full of bread, and the birds are eating the bread out of the baskets. He describes this to Joseph, and Joseph interprets it. Joseph says that the 3 baskets are 3 days, and after 3 days, the baker will be hanged. Not such good news for the baker. Well, it comes to pass that after 3 days, Joseph's interpretation comes true. In verse 20 of Genesis chapter 40, it says, "Now the 3rd day was Pharaoh's birthday, and he gave a feast for all his officials. He lifted up the heads of the chief cupbearer and the chief baker in the presence of his officials. He restored the chief cupbearer to his position so that he once again put the cup into Pharaoh's hand. But he hanged the chief baker, just as Joseph had said to them in his interpretation." So while in prison, Joseph gives a favorable interpretation of restoration to the chief cupbearer, and he gives an unfavorable interpretation of condemnation to the baker. Remember, the cupbearer is in charge of the wine. The wine in the Bible often represents blood. The baker was responsible for the bread. The bread can sometimes represent works of the flesh, as we'll see in a minute. So let's fast forward to the New Testament, Luke chapter 23. We'll see how the story of Joseph and the cupbearer and the baker foreshadows Jesus on the cross between 2 criminals. Verse 32 says, 2 other men, both criminals, were also led out with him to be executed. When they came to the place called the Skull, there they crucified him, along with the criminals, one on his right, the other on his left. So Jesus was crucified between 2 criminals, one on his right and one on his left. Verse 39, one of the criminals who hung there hurled insults at him. "Aren't you the Christ? Save yourself and us." But the other criminal rebuked him. "Don't you fear God," he said, "since you are under the same sentence? We are punished justly, for we are getting what our deeds deserve. But this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." Jesus answered him, "I tell you the truth. Today you will be with me in paradise." So while on the cross, Jesus was flanked by 2 criminals. One mocked and hurled insults at Jesus. The other one puts his faith in Jesus and asks for salvation. Jesus promises to the good thief that he will be with him in paradise. He doesn't say anything to the other thief, at least it's not recorded, so by implication, the other will be condemned. Remember, in prison, Joseph gave a promise of restoration to the cupbaker, the cupbearer, and an unfavorable interpretation to the baker, a message of condemnation. While on the cross, Jesus gives the promise of restoration to the good thief and implies condemnation for the other thief. Remember, this is fulfilled on the 3rd day. Luke 24, verse 7 says, "The Son of Man must be delivered into the hands of sinful men, be crucified, and on the third day be raised again. We know that Jesus rose from the dead on the third day. In Genesis chapter 40, verse 20, remember it said, "Now the third day was Pharaoh's birthday." Jesus rose from the dead as the firstborn from among the dead. The firstborn, that is his birthday, the day of first fruits. So we see a shadow of the two criminals flanking Jesus in the story of Joseph with the cupbearer and the baker. Again, the cupbearer takes care of Pharaoh's wine, and the baker is responsible for the bread. This is also pointing us back to Genesis chapter 4, of the story of Cain and Abel. In Genesis chapter 4, Cain brings an offering of the fruit of the land. The fruit of the land could possibly be fruits, it could be wheat, it could possibly be bread. Whereas Abel brings an offering of the livestock. That would involve blood. So one is associated with bread, the other one is associated with blood. Whose sacrifice did God accept? He accepted Abel's sacrifice, but he did not accept Cain's sacrifice. If we look into symbolism, the blood is the work of Jesus that covers the sinner. We are saved by faith in the blood of Jesus. We are not saved by the works of the flesh. The bread often represents flesh in the Bible. We are saved by the blood, not by works. So we see this symbolism in the story of Cain and Abel's offerings. We see it in the cupbearer and the baker, and we see it in the two criminals on either side of Jesus. Jesus sets before us life and death. Joseph gave to one a promise of restoration, to the other a message of condemnation. On the cross, Jesus tells one thief he will be in paradise, and by implication the other will not. He gives us the same choice. He sets before us life and death. Life is by the blood, death is through works. What will you choose? The parallels between the story of the cupbearer, the baker, and the two criminals on either side of Jesus are just another amazing wonder of the Word. Thanks for listening.